lesson in the study of the book of Judges. Back a number of years ago, I lived in a small rural community in North Florida. One of the things I loved best about that community were all of the people who would bring canned fruits and vegetables and fresh produce, and they would just stock the preacher's home during growing season. But one of the things I particularly remember was a sweet little old lady in the congregation who made the most wonderful pickles that you've ever eaten. She would take them and she would prepare them, and they had just this kind of little tartness to them, but this sweetness. I mean, you could sit down and you could eat a whole jar at any given time. You know what the interesting thing about pickles is that you take the cucumbers and you immerse them in vinegar, sugar, pickling spices, all the things that you put together. But when you do, you change not only the flavor, but the very form and nature of the cucumber that's immersed in all those spices. We live in a time today where we're immersed in a society that's filled with immorality, ungodliness, and we've grown more and more complacent to the world that's around us. We've come to a time where the influences of our society are beginning not only to change our perspectives, but the very nature of the individuals who are living the Christian lives. We become far more tolerant of things like homosexuality or sexual immorality. We let these things into our homes through the television and radio and allow our children to watch things that we would have never dreamed to be permissible a generation ago. I hear lots of justifications as to why we allow ourselves to be immersed in these things. Well, that's just the way society is. Well, our kids are exposed to it all the time. Well, that's just the way things are, and we have to learn to accept it. Well, that was the philosophy in the book of Judges that got them into so much trouble. Our first introduction into one of the actual judges is that of Othniel. But it was under the reign of Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia, that the Israelites first fell into captivity or bondage, for which they had to be delivered by a judge. There's kind of an interesting fact about this particular king of Mesopotamia. His name, when it's translated, means doubly wicked blackness. Now stop and think about that for a time. How would you like to live under the reign and the rule and the domination of a society that was ruled by a man whose name meant doubly wicked blackness? If you've ever seen any of the documentaries about what it's like to be arrested in a foreign country or imprisoned in a third world environment, then you can imagine what it was like for the children of Israel to live under captivity under this wicked king of Mesopotamia. But in verse 9 of chapter 3 in Judges, we find, when the people of Israel cried out to the Lord. I want you to stop and think about the occasions where you turned to prayer, or you turned to God, or you just cried out because the conditions and the circumstances and the struggles of your life were just so horrible. That's the backdrop under which the Israelites were living. Conditions had grown so bad, oppression was so intense, the circumstances of their life were so tragic that they finally turned to God and said, God, we're sorry. God, forgive us. God, please deliver us from all of this. And that's where we're introduced to the first judge of Israel. The first judge, Othniel, the son of Kenaz, who just happens to be Caleb's nephew. Now, when you go back and you look at the history that's behind this, you see that this was a pretty courageous family. At age 85, we find Caleb going into the land that he was promised, going into the very region where the sons of Anak lived, where the giants lived. And in Joshua 14, he says, Lord, give me this mountain, for I am as strong today as I was in the day in which you first took me into the land. Othniel, his nephew, was given Achish, Caleb's daughter, in marriage for a reward for his bravery and his successful expedition against the city of Debir in Joshua 15 and Judges chapter 1. So we see when we're introduced to these characters, we see, one, the importance and influence of family, of background, of the kind of qualities that we want to ingrain in our children and our grandchildren in generations yet unborn. In Caleb's family line, we see courage, we see commitment to God, we see dedication in the hands of Othniel. When Israel was delivered into the hands of Mesopotamia, who did God call first to deliver them? He called an individual who had already demonstrated their courage, an individual who had already shown their ability to lead, someone who had stood up for God in times of struggle, in times of hardship, in times of difficulty. Now, we don't know a whole lot about Othniel. We don't know a whole lot about the circumstances of the domination by the Mesopotamians during this time. But what we do see is God chooses people of character. God chooses people with ability. God chooses people who are working and laboring and ready to serve. As we look at this, the Bible tells us a few important things that we kind of need to take to mind when we're thinking about the world in which we live today, the circumstances and conditions that surround us. First of all, we need to look at the heritage that we're creating. Othniel came from a good heritage, from a good background. We see that he saw the example of his uncle, Caleb, and his courage and his leadership and his devotion through decades of times in which God's people were not faithful. Coming from a noble background, though, isn't enough. You yourself have to embrace those qualities and those characteristics and those values, those good values that are passed down to you from your family and generation. When God calls, or his nation, Othniel was always ready to serve. We see that early in our introduction to Othniel, he was ready to serve, he was ready to go, he was ready to fight. When God called him again, we see that Othniel was ready to go, and he was ready to fight. And sometimes we grow tired, we grow weary. I've been teaching Bible class for 3 years, or why is it that they always call on me? Most of us have heard the statement that if you want to get something done, ask a busy person to do it. God calls us because he believes in us. He has confidence in us. He knows that we can rise up and accomplish great things for the kingdom if we'll only turn to him and surrender our will to his. God's always on the lookout for great leaders. We look at circumstances and sometimes we see the condition of our local congregation and we're discouraged. Or even the condition of the church, and we throw our hands up and say, what's the next generation going to bring? But we need to remember that during the time of Judges, these men lived in a time in which Israel was morally and spiritually weak. It's times where time and time again they struggled and they failed and they stumbled and they fell into sin. But there were always people that were ready to step forward. People that God called, people that stepped into leadership, people of courage and valor, people like Othniel who set a great example. And we need to realize that how we live today, the fights that we fight today, the battles that we engage ourselves in, the opportunities that we accept will prepare us for the next great step in service that God calls us for. These are the proving grounds. That's one reason why that elders in the church are said to first be tested or tried. God wants men and women who are tried in the fire, who are tested, who've demonstrated leadership ability so that they can step up to that next level of leadership and guidance and direction of God. So today, as we look at the book of Judges, as we look at the character of Othniel, I hope that we'll come away from this feeling more committed, more dedicated, more ready to serve God with those great qualities of courage and valor and commitment and dedication and perseverance. Thank you for being with us today.